Scene one night zero. Tira sat by the narrow window in her new dorm room. The distant sounds of laughter and conversation in the halls faded to white noise, almost like a memory. Outside, the deep blue of night had fully settled, casting shadows that crept along the walls as the building made the occasional creak, settling in the cool stillness. She let her gaze drift back to her diary, where empty lines waited almost expectantly, as if they too were poised to begin something new. Her pen hovered. Day one, she wrote, then paused, frowning slightly. Or maybe night zero. It's technically the night before the first day. Confusing, Max's familiar dry voice echoed in her mind. You know, any reader might wonder why you're starting your first day at night. My reader, it's just me, she replied mentally, raising an eyebrow. A good habit is a good habit, Tira, he countered, as calm and steady as always. Audience or no, she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips, even as she rolled her eyes, then set the pen to paper again, writing simply, I'm here. She studied the two words. Stark and bare on the page, they held a quiet weight that seemed fitting, so she left them as they were. Her gaze drifted around the room, taking in the small cracks in the plaster, the rough edges of her desk, and the thin cobweb catching the faint light in the corner. This wasn't the polished dorm she'd pictured, but then again, a school bordering an ancient swamp likely didn't lend itself to polish. Swamp, her mind summoned an image of dark waters, winding roots, and dense mist, a place that felt quietly unsettling, as if it held secrets it would never give up freely. Strange, then, how drawn she felt to it, as though something about it matched a part of herself. A little dramatic, don't you think? Max's voice held a trace of amusement. Coming from a disembodied voice, that's rich, she thought, pressing her pen down harder as she scribbled in the margin. Rumors say the swamp is difficult. Difficult, Max echoed, a thread of humor slipping through. Difficult how? Difficult to navigate, difficult to understand. What is difficult, Tira? She considered, then gave a slight nod. Right now, trying to find the right words is difficult. Closing her diary, she let her hand linger on its worn edges, breathing in deeply to steady herself. Orientation was tomorrow, and with it, her introduction to the 4 houses. Her stomach twisted at the thought. 4 houses, each with its own values, and everyone else seems to know exactly where they belong, she thought, absently running her thumb along the cover of her diary. They've been looking forward to Manaheim all their lives since they were children. But for me, this world is all new. In truth, her arrival here felt almost like an accident. She wasn't part of any legacy or grand family history. She'd slipped through a door she hadn't expected, hoping no one would question her right to be here, wondering, really, if her position was actually meant for someone else. You were invited, Max said gently, almost perceptive. So it is your place. But what if I don't belong? She thought, though she wasn't sure if it was meant for Max to hear. There are worse things than feeling out of place, he replied softly. And Tira, everyone here has secrets. She couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. Quietly, she closed the journal and set it on the bedside table. Secrets, she thought, a quiet thrill flickering through her mind. Maybe. A yawn interrupted her thoughts, and she stretched, feeling the weight of the day settling over her, grounding her in this strange new world. She opened her diary again, adding a final line. I'd like to belong here as much as they do. But maybe it's something I'll have to create for myself. Not your usual brand of optimism, Max remarked, though a warmth softened his tone. Tira tucked the diary under her pillow, letting his words resonate as she slipped under the covers. Her mind drifted back to the students she would meet, the choices she would make, and the secrets waiting within Manaheim's campus and the shadowed swamp beyond. In the silence of her room, her first night alone felt unexpectedly peaceful, the quiet holding her like a gentle promise of good things to come. Scene 2, a helping hand. The morning light crept into Tira's room, gentle and pale. She stretched, savoring the solitude as she went about her routine. For the first time, and perhaps the only time, she could take her time. No shared space, no jostling for mirrors or missing hair ties. She slipped into her usual outfit, black sweater, skirt, leggings, and sturdy combat boots. She glanced in the mirror, brushing her dark hair back, her gaze lingering on the orange tint in her right eye, unique, Max once told her, though it had never quite felt like a compliment. Lovely attire for a swamp, Max remarked, his tone as dry as ever. It'll be fine, she thought back, focusing on brushing her hair. It's a magic school. Surely they have magical washing machines. Perhaps, but it's good to be mindful of your choices, he replied, as if mentally jotting down notes. She smirked, a hint of anxiety threatening to tug her back, but the steady rhythm of her morning routine had a calming effect. Even as she brushed her teeth, Max's quiet presence lent a sense of ease. With some time to spare, Tira decided to venture out to Hadbuck's, hoping a coffee might soothe her lingering nerves before orientation. She headed out, slipping through the early crowd of students with quiet ease. But just as she was reaching the hallway's end, she caught sight of someone struggling with a precarious stack of bags and boxes. The girl was teetering under her load, strawberry blonde hair spilling across her face, and a bright yellow beanie resting on the ground nearby, evidently lost in the shuffle. Tira paused, her hand halfway to her bag, debating. That's Addie, Max commented, his tone slipping slightly as though stating the obvious. A bit more lively than your usual crowd, don't you think? The girl was practically vibrating with energy, her cheerful mutterings barely contained by her towering stack of luggage. Tira could just make out hold up, as Addie tried to balance what looked like half her life's belongings. And I'm supposed to help her, she thought, mildly exasperated by the sight. Another choice, Max replied lightly. She could use a hand, or you could simply get coffee. With a small sigh of resignation, Tira approached. Need a hand? She asked, her voice cutting through the creak and groan of Addie's overloaded boxes. Oh, are you Tira? Addie exclaimed, her face lighting up as though Tira's offer was the best thing that had happened all morning. Good on you for stopping by. Thought I'd be carting this lot up myself. Yeah? Say, you look exactly like I imagined. Tira's eyebrows lifted, taken aback by Addie's enthusiasm. Exactly like she imagined, with this eye? She thought a touch skeptical. Her orange eye was, to her knowledge, one of a kind. Might as well embrace it, Max murmured. She seems eager. Aw, you're a legend, Tira. I swear, usually I've got myself sorted, but, new school, new dorm, all that jazz. Addie beamed, her words spilling out in a jumble of excitement. Guess we're gonna be thick as beans, eh? Tira managed a polite nod. Yeah, I guess so, she said, trying to keep her tone calm even as Addie's boundless energy made her feel slightly overwhelmed. They continued down the hall, Addie's colorful bags and boxes filling the space around them. Addie adjusted a strap on one of the bags, balancing her load on one hip as she rolled her eyes at her own mess. Good thing you're here, though, Addie added with a grin. I'd probably have made a right scene if I tripped over this lot. Got a bit too much oomph for my own good sometimes. She laughed, a sound as warm as it was bright, and Tira found herself smiling despite her usual reserve. As they reached the door to their dorm, Tira sensed Max's presence again, like an amused observer in the background. Perhaps a bit much oomph will be good for you too, he noted dryly. Tira ignored him, though she couldn't help but wonder if he was right. Scene 3 Roommate Revelations. Back in the dorm, Tira found herself knee-deep in Addie's belongings. Lifting a stack of books out of one of her haphazardly packed bags and carefully placing them on the shelf. Around her, Addie's things sprawled across the room in colorful disarray, a mix of camping gear, school supplies, clothes, and a few personal trinkets. I've got to say, mate, I didn't expect to have a roomie as cool as you, Addie grinned, dusting off a red bandana she'd just found among her things. She wrapped it around her wrist, tying it in a knot with practiced ease. This here's from my mum. She loved camping out in the bush under the stars, all that good stuff. We used to go all the time when I was a kid. Tira's gaze drifted to Addie's camping gear and trinkets, absorbing the warmth and ease her new roommate brought to the memory. Camping was a regular thing. Oh, for sure, Addie replied, her voice taking on a softer tone as she recalled her memories. She always said being close to nature made her feel alive, like really alive. For a moment, Tira thought about nights spent alone in the graveyard, where the cool, damp air clung to the silence around her. She hadn't considered it camping, not in the usual sense, and she certainly didn't want to share it here. She forced a small shrug and said, "Oh, no, I haven't really gone camping much." Max's voice slipped into her thoughts, quiet but perceptive. "She'd probably understand more than you think, Tira." "It's not exactly the kind of story that warms people up to you," she replied inwardly. "My life's a mood killer." Addie took her answer in stride, seemingly unbothered, and went on. "Well, there's just something about being out there," she said, her voice thoughtful as she pulled out a small trinket, a copper bracelet with worn etchings. "Mom always said fire wasn't there to be controlled. It's there to be understood. Kinda like magic, I guess, dangerous, beautiful. Something that's got its own way of being." The word magic stirred something in Tira, drawing her back to an old memory. She recalled a time when she'd been filled with anger as a child, clutching a flower in her hand and watching as it slowly wilted, its life force seeming to pulse briefly into her veins. The memory, distant and a little haunting, lingered as she watched Addie's animated expression. But instead of sharing it, Tira simply said, I guess I haven't really thought about it like that." "Funny how you can look at the same thing and see so many sides," Addie mused. "Mum used to say that people are just as complex as anything we find out there in the woods." Tira nodded, intrigued but guarded, feeling the prickling sense of Max's presence nearby. "You're welcome to talk about yourself as well, Tira. It's a conversation after all." The thought lingered, light but pressing. She glanced at Addie, who was busy unfolding a hammock and recounting a story about how she'd once caught her shirt on fire trying to roast marshmallows. "What about your mum, then?" Addie asked, her gaze shifting to Tira, curious and without judgment. "What is she like?" Tira hesitated, feeling Max's subtle support, but knowing her answer would change the tone of their talk. She chose her words with care, keeping her voice steady. "My mother, I don't really know her. I'm an orphan." "Oh," Addie replied softly, but to Tira's surprise, her expression was one of interest, not pity. "Well, maybe that just means you've got a whole new story waiting to be written, huh?" The casual warmth in Addie's tone left Tira a bit disarmed, but before she could consider a reply, the clock caught her eye. "We should probably head to orientation," she said, letting the moment pass as she felt a sense of relief. Addie's grin returned as she glanced at the time. "Right. Wouldn't want to miss the big first day, huh?" Slinging a backpack over her shoulder, she nudged Tira's arm, her energy as boundless as ever. Tira took a final look around the room, feeling a touch lighter, before meeting Addie's eyes. "Yeah," she replied, her voice soft but sincere. "Let's go." As they stepped out into the hallway, Max's voice lingered in her mind, a subtle warmth underlying his words. "Perhaps you'll be surprised by what you find out there." With a faint private smile, Tira followed Addie, feeling, for the first time, a small flicker of anticipation alongside the anxiety. Scene 4: the houses of Manaheim. The campus glistened under the morning light as Tira and Addie walked. The crisp autumn air, carrying the scent of wood smoke, mingled with the damp, earthy undertone from the nearby swamp. Addie's pace was lively, her words a cheerful stream that Tira had to work to keep up with, both physically and mentally. "I mean, Tira, just imagine trying to study while a phoenix flies by your window. How do they expect us to focus with all these distractions?" Addie asked, half dancing and spinning around as she spoke, somehow managing not to trip on the uneven cobblestones beneath them. Tira chuckled, her gaze sweeping across the bustling quad where most students moved confidently in clusters or pairs. Many wore shades of blue and white, the colors of the azure bears, and the sheer number of them filled the space, their familiar camaraderie lending a sense of unity whether they were athletic or academic, or anywhere in between. A few of them carried books or sported scarves against the morning chill, the light fabric wrapped snugly around their necks as they laughed in comfortable harmony. "Yep, the bears," Addie noted, catching Tira's gaze. "Friendly, I'll give them that, but they're also, let's just say they're very into the rules and what others think about them. I mean, don't get me wrong, every school needs a few teachers' pets. It's just that not everyone is a bear, you know." Tira nodded thoughtfully. She had read about the Azure Bears and their emphasis on reliability and community. They're the school's backbone, she mused, the ones who bring order and stability. Part of her respected that she could relate to their dedication and the comfort of structure. But their collective focus reminded her of a hive mindset, and she wondered if she'd feel out of place, much like she had in the orphanage. She considered herself reliable, and community sounded nice in theory, but she kept circling back to her instinct to follow her own path. You don't think you'd fit among them? Max's voice slipped into her thoughts, gentle but curious. Not really, Tira replied inwardly, glancing at the bears again as they passed. I mean, they're fine, but they follow the trends, and I don't think I could do that so easily. She paused, trying to untangle her own reluctance. There's more than one way to find community, I think. True, Max murmured, leaving her to her reflections as Addie continued talking, her words only quieting as they neared a small group of students wearing crimson and black. Their presence was unmistakable, crimson tigers, confident in their silence as they observed those passing by with a collected ease. Addie lowered her voice as they passed, her tone more curious than critical. The tigers there, well, the best way I can put it is, it's like a private club. I heard it's really tough to get in, and they like it that way. They're under a lot of pressure, though, constant high standards. Not sure I could handle that. She paused, eyes glinting as she leaned in closer. Professor Roslin, their house leader, punishes cheaters by turning them into toads. Not because they cheated, mind you, but because they didn't get away with it. She chuckled. It's all about being the best at all costs with them, as long as you're clever enough not to get caught. Tira couldn't help watching the tigers, noticing the way they moved with such control and certainty. They intrigued her, partly because their high standards struck a chord with her, but she couldn't help wondering if she'd measure up. The question lingered, would she ever be good enough for a place like that? But at the same time, part of her knew she wasn't fully ready to answer it. You're staring, Max remarked with a hint of amusement. Curiosity? I don't know. Maybe I just wonder if I'd measure up, not if I'd fit in, she thought, letting herself linger on the question as Max gently probed her. But I don't want to know yet, Max, not yet. Curiosity can be a tricky thing, Tira, he replied with a quiet understanding, and he let her be. Addie's voice cut through her thoughts, pulling her back to the present. Hey, Tira, are you listening? Tira blinked, managing a faint smile. You were talking about the verdant deer, right? She straightened, letting Addie's enthusiastic description settle in her mind. You were saying they're known as misfits, the ones who think differently. But they care about meaningful things. Empathy, idealism, depth, and I guess people see them as a bit quirky for that. Addie looked at her with surprise, her gaze softening with a new level of respect. Wow, Tira, you're actually a really good listener. Like really good. I could talk forever and you'd just keep listening. Her smile turned a little bashful, as if she were recognizing for the first time how much she'd been talking. Tira nodded, letting Addie's approval settle over her, feeling both amused and slightly guarded. At the orphanage it was don't speak unless spoken to, so listening came naturally. It allowed her to understand people without having to reveal much about herself. And with Addie, who seemed to fill any silence with her cheerful chatter, it was easy to slip into that role. In her mind, Max gently nudged, his voice like a quiet observation. You could share a little more. It's allowed, you know. I don't mind listening, Max, she thought, feeling the weight of his suggestion but resisting it. I don't want to act prematurely or get too invested before I even know what house I'm in. Maybe so, but she is your roommate. Max replied, though his tone was thoughtful. Choosing not to act is still a choice. They soon arrived at the entrance to the great hall that contained the auditorium, where the towering stone building cast a long shadow over the cobblestones, its ivy-draped walls looming in quiet anticipation. The arched windows glowed with soft morning light, and Tira felt a sudden tightening in her chest as she looked up at the imposing structure. Everything about this day, the sorting, the ceremony, the mystery of which house she'd be placed into, carried a weight she hadn't fully felt until this moment. Addie glanced at Tira, sensing her hesitation, and gave her a supportive smile. Don't worry, mate. Whatever house you end up in, you're still a friend of mine. And if anyone can't see how great you are, well, they're just full of rotty beans." Tira felt a pang of surprise at the warmth in Addie's words. They'd only just met after all, but something about Addie's optimism was strangely comforting. It was both refreshing and slightly unnerving, like a promise she hadn't expected. Before she could respond, Addie flashed her a wink and bounded up the steps with boundless energy, her laughter echoing back to Tira. "Come on, Slowpoke, we've got history to make," she called, taking 2 steps at a time. Tira took a steadying breath, feeling Max's silent presence by her side, steady and reassuring. "Perhaps you'll find you're more ready for this than you think," he murmured. With a small private smile, Tira followed Addie, climbing the steps to the great hall and feeling the weight of anticipation blend with the first hint of excitement. Scene 5: The Golden Eagles inside the grand hall. The hum of voices echoed off towering stone walls. Chandeliers cast a warm, flickering glow over the rows of benches and tall arched windows, where beams of early light filtered through, tinting the space in hues of amber and blue. Tira let her gaze wander up toward the intricately carved ceiling, taking in the Gothic architecture with a mix of awe and trepidation. Ahead, Addie's voice rose cheerfully. "Oi, Mac! Tommy, over here!" Tara watched as 2 boys turned, one in a bright golden-yellow jacket with the Golden Eagles emblem stitched boldly on the back. He stood out among the mostly pale faces with his deep skin tone, broad-shouldered, and wearing a pair of bulky headphones that sat around his neck. The confidence in his stride was palpable, as if he were already a golden eagle. Beside him, the second boy had blue-dyed hair and thick-rimmed glasses. He wore a charcoal sweater with a small, subtle golden eagle's pin on the collar, a quieter but equally proud nod to his hopes. Mac's face lit up with a broad grin when he saw Addie, and he reached out to pull her into a playful one-armed hug before turning his attention to Tira. He extended a hand, his grip firm as he shook hers, then pulled her in for a quick one-armed hug as well. Tira stiffened slightly, surprised by the easy familiarity and the strong, spicy scent of cologne. "Mac," he said, tapping his chest with his thumb. "You're Addie's new roomie, huh? You're gonna need a pair of headphones too if you're roomin' with her," he teased with a laugh. Tira found herself smiling, caught a bit off guard but charmed by his warmth. "Nice to meet you, Mac," she replied, feeling Max's presence perk up in amused curiosity at the group dynamic. Mac released her, flashing a wink, then turned back to Addie. "Looks like you scored a good one, Addie. Lucky find. Meanwhile, I'm stuck with this clown." He jerked a thumb toward the other boy, who rolled his eyes with a wry grin. "That's like gravity accusing mass of being too attractive," the boy retorted, elbowing Mac in the ribs with a clever smirk. "Wait, what?" Mac laughed, trying to wrap his head around the concept. Addie laughed, a little louder than Tara had heard before, and there was an easy tomboyish energy to her around the 2 boys. "Tira, this is Tommy," she said, gesturing to the boy with the blue hair. "Brains of the group, definitely, as you can see." Tommy gave Tira a polite nod, a bit more reserved than Mac's open friendliness. "Nice to meet you, Tira," he said simply, and his handshake was quick but firm. She noted the way his gaze held a calm intelligence, observing rather than dominating. Something about his quiet energy seemed to balance Mac's bold presence, adding a layer of subtlety to the house she hadn't expected. As she took in Tommy's composed demeanor alongside the lively energy of Addie and Mac, Tira felt a flicker of new respect for the Golden Eagles. She had once thought of their house as brash and straightforward, yet here was Tommy, a reminder that depth often hid beneath the surface. The comfortable familiarity among the 3 of them and unspoken camaraderie brought out an unexpected pang of envy. They felt like they belonged, like they'd already formed a bond with each other, while she was still testing the waters, unsure of her place. Mac crossed his arms, his tone shifting to something more animated. "So, Addie, did you catch the Mana Ball match yesterday?" he asked, his eyes lighting up with excitement. "Oh, it was a mess," Addie replied, diving right in. "The offense was strong, but the defense, don't get me started. It's like they forgot what their bloody jobs were. Absolutely infuriating." The 2 of them launched into a lively discussion about the players and strategies. their words weaving in and out of terms Tira vaguely recognized but didn't fully understand. Max's voice floated into her mind, almost as if he were smirking. Manaball, the school's prize sport. Care to try out for the team? Let me get through orientation first, she replied dryly, amused by his assumption. Watching them talk, she realized this sporty side of Addie was one she hadn't yet seen. It was almost refreshing, and Tira found herself imagining, if only for a moment, what it might be like to fit seamlessly into their world. After a bit, Tommy turned to Tira with a thoughtful look. So, Tira, he began, his tone both welcoming and curious, are you looking to be a golden eagle like the rest of us? Tira hesitated, her mind flickering with thoughts she hadn't quite solidified yet. I'm not really sure, she replied, keeping her tone casual, though she felt Max's silent encouragement to open up a bit more. I guess I see something here, but only time will tell. Tommy nodded, a glimmer of understanding in his eyes. Fair enough, he said, then added with a wry smile. Believe it or not, I'm the odd one out in my family. My parents and older siblings are all azure bears, practically a tradition. I guess I figured it was time to break the mold. She raised an eyebrow, surprised but intrigued by this unexpected revelation. Really? And you chose the Golden Eagles over the Bears? Yep, they're great, he said with a shrug, but I wanted a path that was different. Felt right to go against the grain, you know. A newfound respect for Tommy flickered within her. His calm presence was anything but ordinary, and his quiet decision to stand apart from his family's legacy added a layer of boldness she hadn't anticipated. Suddenly, the Golden Eagles seemed like more than just a house. They felt like a choice, one that held surprising depth. Just as Tira was about to respond, Mac interjected, looking between them with a broad grin. Oh, I forgot to mention, looks like we're all in the same group. His eyebrows shot up, eyes gleaming with excitement. Heard they're splitting us into groups of 10 for the big test. A group exam? Tira echoed, glancing between them, intrigued. Tommy took the lead, nodding with a faint smile. Yeah, it's part of how they're evaluating us. Apparently, they want to see how we work together under less predictable conditions. The environment is supposed to bring out our true selves, or so my siblings say. Addie tilted her head, curiosity clear on her face. So if we're supposed to be going into the swamp, why are we all meeting here at the auditorium instead of the docks? Tommy shrugged, a glint of excitement in his eyes. Guess they want to keep us on our toes. Maybe it's part of the test, not knowing exactly what to expect. Just then the doors to the auditorium creaked open, and a stern woman dressed in squash and zucchini-colored robes stepped out, gesturing for the students to enter. Her expression was unreadable, and her sharp eyes scanned the crowd as though assessing each student before they even stepped foot inside. The murmur of voices quieted instantly, and one by one, students began filing into the hall. Addie glanced back at Tira, her expression a mix of curiosity and encouragement. Guess we're about to find out what's next. Yeah. Tira took a deep breath, feeling the weight of anticipation settle over her. Whatever awaited them inside, it would be the first step towards something bigger, something she was both nervous and eager to uncover. Scene 6, a crowded auditorium. Tira stepped into the auditorium, her gaze skimming over rows upon rows of wooden seats stretching toward the distant, shadowed stage. The air was thick with chatter, laughter, and the muffled scuffing of shoes against the old wood. She took a step forward, but a floorboard gave slightly under her foot, and she stiffened, glancing down. The room was far less grand than she'd pictured, something barely altered over the past century. Without the magical enhancements she'd imagined a place like Manaheim would offer. She could already feel the press of warm bodies around her, shoulders and elbows nearly brushing against her own. Max's voice flickered softly in her mind, something like, usually more refined, before fading, overwhelmed by the hundreds of voices overlapping and bouncing off the walls. She felt a pang of quiet panic at the distance, a reminder of how alone she was in the chaotic sea of students. Addie nudged her with an elbow, pulling her back into the present. Bit snug for a magic school, huh? Tira gave a short nod, her senses still adjusting to the space. Addie was already squeezing past a line of students to claim a row halfway down. Tira followed, and as they slid into their seats, she felt the immediate discomfort of the hard, unforgiving wood pressing into her legs. The seat was compact, barely wide enough, and she could feel the warmth radiating from the students crowded around her, the mix of their scents, too much body spray, hints of sweat, and the unmistakable smell of late teenagers. She estimated they were all around 18, though her early admission meant she was a bit younger than most. Just as she was acclimating to her space, the boy beside her shifted to face her, offering a friendly smile. He had medium-length blonde hair the color of sunlit hay, a warm, soft yellow that brought to mind fields in summer. He extended his hand with a confidence that seemed to cut through the noise. "Bannock McBain," he said, his voice somehow clear over the din, carrying a warmth that was hard to ignore. Caught slightly off guard, Tira managed a polite smile and on impulse gave her full name. "Teresa Walder, but everyone calls me Tira." She felt a small pulse of embarrassment. She hadn't even shared her full name with Addie, but somehow Bannock's easy presence seemed to draw it out of her effortlessly. "Teresa, huh?" he repeated with a grin. "Proper." His tone was friendly, almost teasing, and Tira felt a strange flutter in her chest at his relaxed, confident demeanor. Teresa, Max's faint voice nudged into her mind, barely cutting through the noise, something like, "Smitten are we," before fading out again. She felt herself flush, a little annoyed at Max's amusement, but also missing the clarity of his voice. "Maybe it's a good thing I can barely hear you," she thought, feeling Max's soft, distant laugh in return. "I'm Kenny Broadnoxie," came a louder voice to her left, practically booming to compete with the clamor of the room. Bannock turned to his friend, and Tira saw the boy beside him, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who looked distinctly uncomfortable, wedged into the small seat. His short brown hair was combed neatly, and a look of irritation flickered across his face as he shifted his knees, clearly frustrated. These seats, like they were made for pixies 100 years ago. Tira stifled a laugh, nodding as she glanced between Kenny and Bannock. The seats were clearly a frustration for anyone larger than average, and Kenny looked every bit as if he were trying to squeeze into a doll's chair. The girl beside him gave Tira a soft, sympathetic smile. Her brown hair fell in gentle waves over her shoulders, her hazel eyes shifting between her brother and Tira. "Sorry," she mouthed amongst other words, but her voice was completely suffocated by the people around her. "Thanks, Kelly," Kenny muttered, rolling his eyes but flashing her a faint smile of appreciation. His gaze shifted to Tira, giving her a quick nod, and he said something that she could barely make out, too many words, and too fast in the din, but she nodded back politely, pretending she'd heard. The girl leaned forward slightly, offering Tira a more readable smile. "I'm Kelly," she said, her tone gentle, yet likely her version of a yell. There was an openness to her expression, an empathy that seemed as natural as her brother's mild criticisms. Bannock leaned in toward Tira again, giving her a reassuring smile that immediately calmed her. "Nothing like meeting 100 new friends at once, right?" This time his words reached her clearly. The warmth in his voice, so unruffled and natural, had a calming effect on her, and she felt a spark of admiration she kept carefully hidden. Bannock was handsome, she thought, feeling a faint warmth rise in her cheeks that she hoped wasn't obvious. Max's voice filtered back in, still distant, but laced with clear amusement. "I don't recall. Blushed this morning." She didn't respond, feeling a mix of irritation and affection for Max's timing, and instead kept her attention on Bannock, who continued, "Oh, and you'll meet a few others, too. Devin Grazzo, Valerie Magnoti, and Elizabeth Hadbucks." Tira noticed a blush start to form in Bannock's face, but quickly realized that he was no longer looking at her. Tira followed his glance, her eyes landing on a striking girl with bright pink-gold hair a few seats to her right, sitting next to Mac. The surname Hadbucks immediately rang a bell. It was the name of the coffee shop she was planning to go to earlier that morning, and Elizabeth's poise and appearance made her stand out in the sea of students. There was something about her, a presence, that made Tira feel as though she commanded attention without even trying. She had a look that was polished, perfect almost, which stirred a faint sense of rivalry within Tira that she wasn't expecting to feel. She didn't even know the girl. Elizabeth was deep in conversation with Mac and Tommy, both of whom looked completely captivated by her. Addie's face soured, her eyes narrowing as she watched the scene with a look that was equal parts envy and irritation. Figures, Addie muttered to Tira, crossing her arms. Not surprising that someone like her would catch attention. She probably uses magic just to make herself look like that. Tira stifled a smile, sensing Addie's jealousy, which she found surprisingly endearing. She gently redirected her friend's focus. "I'll introduce you to Bannock here," she said, nudging her slightly. "He's my seatmate." Addie's gaze shifted, and she brightened slightly, looking Bannock over with an appraising smile. "Nice to meet you, Bannock." Bannock grinned, his charm instantly breaking through Addie's mood. "Addie, right? Looks like we've got quite the group here." He glanced between them, his casual confidence putting both Tira and Addie at ease. Watching them, Tira couldn't help but admire Bannock's natural ability to connect with people, his easy warmth balancing Addie's energy. Max's voice filtered back into clarity as the noise softened. "Looks like you'll have friends no matter what house you're placed into, Tira?" he remarked with a hint of something that felt almost like pride. Just as Tira began to feel a tentative sense of belonging, the lights slowly dimmed, and a hush swept through the room. The candles flickered lower, casting faces and shadows, and Tira felt a momentary calm as the volume ebbed, allowing Max's presence to fully return. As the last whispers faded, Tira's heartbeat slowed, and she felt a renewed sense of steadiness as the orientation was about to begin. Scene 7, the headmaster's address. As the lights dimmed, a soft hush fell over the crowd, conversations dying to murmurs before fading altogether. Tira felt Max's presence clear and steady, his silence a calm that contrasted with the hushed excitement around her. She let her eyes drift to the stage, her heartbeat steadying as a spotlight illuminated a tall, older man in deep purple robes, whose face held an air of scholarly severity. Headmaster Aubergine stepped forward, his hands clasped before him in a gesture that commanded the room's attention. "Welcome, students," his voice carried across the room, strong and measured as though it were amplified by magic. "Welcome to Manaheim Academy. It is here that generations of young minds have come to pursue the arcane, to forge knowledge and strength, to confront challenges, both of the world and of the self." He paused, letting his words settle, and Tira could sense his pride. For a moment she felt a pang of excitement, the weight of the Academy's history making the air feel charged. Addie leaned over, whispering, "Not exactly the thrill of a lifetime, eh?" Her tone was light-hearted, but the jab was clear. Tira stifled a laugh, shooting her a look of amused warning. From Tira's left, Kenny shot a frown in Addie's direction, his lips pressed into a tight line. "Show some respect," he muttered, barely loud enough for Tira to catch. His reaction wasn't missed by Tira, who noticed his frustration was more than just a mild annoyance. Golden eagles versus azure bears, she thought, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she sensed the clash of their natures. Headmaster Aubergine continued, unfazed by the crowd's subtle murmurs. "Manaheim was founded on principles as unyielding as the foundations of this building, though admittedly with more sturdy craftsmanship, it would seem." The headmaster's gaze flicked over the room, a glimmer of humor flashing in his eyes before vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. Tira straightened, suddenly feeling the auditorium's imperfections with new awareness. It was as though the building's ancient wood and worn seats whispered its history, carrying secrets she couldn't yet know. Headmaster Aubergine gestured to his right, where the woman in robes of deep squash and zucchini, who had ushered them into the auditorium, stepped forward. Her presence was commanding, her expression stern, and even before she spoke, Tira felt the atmosphere sharpen around her. "Madame Courgette will now introduce our house professors and provide the necessary instructions for your examination," he announced, his tone softening only slightly in the woman's presence. He stepped back, giving her the floor. Madame Courgette inclined her head, her gaze scanning the room as though sizing up each student individually. "Good evening," she began. Her voice was squeaky with age, yet as firm as her posture. Before you embark on your first test at Manaheim, it is imperative you understand the values our four houses embody. Each house is represented by its professor, whose leadership upholds the house's standards and guides its students. With a sweep of her hand, she gestured to the edge of the stage where the first professor, a tall, broad-shouldered man clad in cobalt blue and silver, stepped forward. His presence was imposing, his jaw set with a discipline that seemed to radiate from every angle of his form. He nodded solemnly to the students, a subtle but unmistakable mark of respect for the next generation. "This is Professor Slater, head of Azure Bears," Madame Courgette announced. Professor Slater is a former Templar knight, known for his valor and unyielding dedication to order. Her gaze shifted over the crowd, and Tira noticed the small approving nods among some students. She couldn't shake the faint distaste that rose in her, the sight of Professor Slater stirring memories of her father, before her days at the orphanage. She could see the look of pride in Kenny's face as he observed the stoic, formidable professor. His presence seemed to reflect the more rigid side of the Azure Bears, the same emphasis on loyalty, tradition, and authority that her father had tried to instill in her. But for Tira, those years had taught her to be silent. She held her breath, pushing away the memories that rose to the surface. The applause was measured but respectful, fading as a woman in flowing crimson robes and laden with jewelry stepped forward next. Her gaze was sharp, assessing, and her posture exuded a kind of regal severity. "Professor Roslin," Madame Courgette continued, her tone neutral, "head of the Crimson Tigers. Professor Roslin's tenure is marked by her keen intelligence and her unyielding pursuit of excellence. She does not tolerate failure." There was an undertone of warning in her words that left an uneasy ripple across the crowd, as though failure itself might be punished by Professor Roslin personally. For a moment Tira felt her pulse quicken, a curiosity sparking within her. There was something about Professor Roslin that reminded her of the abilities she kept hidden, the dark arts she'd dabbled in, secrets she'd unearthed alone, like the wilted flower in her hand when she'd been overwhelmed with anger, feeling the life seep from it and pulse into her own veins. Max's presence had always been a comfort, a constant reminder of her own power's potential. But could someone like Roslin help her harness it, or maybe help her understand what her connection to Max truly meant? Max's voice brushed against her mind, faint but warm, as though sensing her thoughts. "Be cautious, Tira," he murmured, but there was a hint of intrigue there too. The allure of Roslin's unyielding focus resonated with Tira, even if it left her unsettled. The applause for Professor Roslin was more subdued, though tinged with a mix of admiration and apprehension. Next, Madame Courgette gestured to a man whose pearly smile seemed to radiate effortless charm even before he moved. Professor Flavio stepped forward with an easy grace, his golden robes catching the light as though woven with threads of sunlight. He was undeniably striking, and Tira found herself momentarily captivated, her heart skipping a beat. Something about him reminded her of Elizabeth, the confident, magnetic presence that seemed to draw people in effortlessly. "Professor Flavio, head of Golden Eagles," Madame Courgette said, a faint crack of irritation in her voice. "His leadership embodies freedom and creativity, though he has yet to prove that his methods will produce as much discipline as they do enthusiasm." Laughter and applause erupted from pockets of the auditorium, louder than before, as though the students themselves couldn't help but respond to Professor Flavio's charisma. Even Addie, Mac, and Tommy rose to their feet. Tira felt her resolve waver slightly. She could see why so many were drawn to him, and a faint tug in her chest hinted at her own intrigue. But as she glanced back toward Elizabeth, the same allure yet unease settled in her stomach. Lastly, a young woman with unusual, almost otherworldly features stepped forward, her robes in hues of emerald and silver. Her pointed ears and slightly alien structure gave her an exotic beauty, and she looked more like a student than a professor. "Professor Myrtle, head of Verdant Deer," Madame Courgette announced. Professor Myrtle is known for her empathy and her deep connection to the natural world, embodying the ideals of harmony and resilience. Her words were softer now, and Tira sensed a deep respect under the surface. As Tira observed her, she caught a detail she hadn't noticed at first. Professor Myrtle's eyes a striking shade of amber orange, possibly the exact color Tira herself had in one eye, a trait her mother had shared. Her pulse quickened with a sense of wonder, as though Professor Myrtle's presence held a key to the mysteries of her mother's heritage. She was taken aback, feeling the connection in her gut, a curiosity blossoming that went beyond house allegiances or rivalry. For the first time she felt a desire to learn more about her own roots, the secrets her mother had left behind. The applause was gentle, almost reverent, a reflection of the verdant deer's calm, nurturing presence. As the last applause faded, Madame Courgette's gaze sharpened. "Now to the matter of your examination." Her voice cut through the lingering whispers, bringing a renewed focus to the room. "You will enter the examination area in groups of 10 through a portal on the stage." She gestured to a dormant archway behind her that Tira hadn't noticed prior. "Each group will be evaluated based on individual performance, teamwork, and adaptability under unknown conditions." Tira felt a surge of anticipation ripple through her, a quiet thrill at the thought of stepping into the unknown. "You will not be given answers to your questions that arise," Madame Courgette continued. "In fact, part of your task will be to navigate the unfamiliar without guidance. Consider it a test of both intellect and instinct." Her gaze swept over the rows of students, lingering as though searching for those who were truly listening. "Trust the process," she intoned with quiet, reverberating strength, "and remember that true knowledge is earned, not given." A ripple of silence settled over the crowd, a weight of unspoken words and lingering doubts. Tira felt a sense of resolve harden within her, a quiet determination that balanced her unease. Whatever awaited them, she would face it. As the applause dimmed and the lights rose, students began murmuring to each other, the weight of the instructions settling in. Bannock leaned toward Tira and Addie, his usual cheer dampened slightly, but his eyes bright with anticipation. "So, that was a lot," Bannock said with a grin, his voice pitched low. "You both ready for this?" His question carried both eagerness and a hint of vulnerability, a quiet reminder that the unknown loomed just as large for him. Addie shrugged, rolling her eyes with mock bravado. "Exciting enough for me. I'd much rather tackle a challenge than take a boring test." Tira took a breath, allowing Max's presence to settle her. "Just trying to embrace the uncertainty," she replied softly, glancing at the portal ahead. "You'll find you're more ready than you think," Max murmured, his voice warm and clear now. Bannock chuckled, catching Tira's look, and offered a small reassuring nod. "Together, then, whatever happens next." Scene 8. Into the swamp. As Tira and her group stepped onto the stage, the purple glow of the portal cast an eerie, shifting light over them. She watched each group ahead vanish into it, the shimmer marking each departure with a final ripple, as if the portal needed time to reset, to adapt. There was a moment of quiet anticipation as they waited to step through. Tira's foot settled on the creaky floorboard beneath her, but as she crossed into the glow, the old wood faded beneath her step, replaced by something soft and wet. Her pupils contracted sharply as the light enveloped her, a flash that left her blinking, and she felt the air thicken with boggy humidity, a stark contrast to the dry, crowded auditorium. The echo of whispers and shuffling seats faded away, replaced by the persistent buzz of insects and the wet weight of humid air. As her vision adjusted, she looked down to see dark, marshy soil swallowing her boots, and she shifted her weight to avoid sinking further, feeling the mud give beneath her feet with a squelching sound. Around her the group stumbled as they, too, adjusted to the swamp's oppressive atmosphere. Liz pulled back, her nose wrinkling in disgust as she glanced down at her mud-streaked shoes. Bannock moved to steady Kelly, who seemed surprised by the unsteady footing. Devon and Val, unfazed, observed their surroundings with quiet focus, their faces set in unreadable expressions. "You're nervous," Max observed with a quiet, dry amusement, sensing her tension. Tira did not respond, but made it clear that she didn't want him to guide her or tell her what to do. This was her test after all, and she wanted to approach it on her own terms. She took a breath, feeling the weight of his presence settle into the background as she focused on the situation at hand. "Would have been nice if they'd told us what we were supposed to be doing." Kenny grumbled, frustration crossing his face as he adjusted to the squelching ground underfoot. Maybe figuring it out is the whole point, Tommy chimed in, a grin flashing across his face as he gathered materials along the ground, inspecting them closely. He'd already fashioned a simple rope by weaving together some vines, and finding a piece of wood coated in a strangely flammable sap, had begun making a makeshift torch. "Mac, Addie, can you guys help gather more vines?" he called, his enthusiasm for the task evident. "They're probably testing how we handle being left to our own devices," Liz said, her tone confident and dismissive, as if the entire exercise was just a minor inconvenience to her. "Just stay out of the muck," she added with a scowl, nudging a particularly vile-looking puddle with her toe. She barely gave anyone time to respond before striding forward, expecting the others to follow. Tira noticed a clear divide forming within the group. Kenny's gaze shifted back to Bannock, his loyalty unwavering, as he urged Kelly to stand beside him in support of Bannock's suggestion to stay together. Bannock, ever the peacemaker, looked between his friends and Liz's group, as if trying to find a path forward that wouldn't lead to a split. "Notice how easily they fall into their roles," Max murmured, but Tira brushed it aside, focused on the dynamics playing out before her. "So any guesses about what we're meant to do here?" Tira asked Bannock quietly, watching the way he seemed to weigh each person's reaction. "Not really," he admitted with a gentle shrug, a humble honesty that made Tira feel as though he could admit uncertainty without losing confidence. "But I think sticking together might help us figure it out faster." He raised his voice, directing his words to the others. "Listen, if we work together, we'll figure out what we're supposed to be doing. Wandering off might make it harder to find any clues." Liz narrowed her gaze, a smirk forming as she met Bannock's eyes. "Oh sure, let's take orders from you," she replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look, Bannock, we don't have time to stand around talking. I say we pick a direction, find the edge of this place, and go from there." Kenny spoke up, his voice tense. "Bannock's got the right idea. Maybe if we cooperate instead of racing, we'll get somewhere." "I hope you don't sink," Liz said, her tone cool and dismissive. Tira felt a flash of irritation at Liz's tone, but admired Bannock's calm as he nodded, choosing not to escalate things. Kenny's frustration was visible, but Bannock placed a steadying hand on his friend's shoulder, quietly maintaining the peace. "He's keeping the group together, even if it costs him," Tira thought, admiring his quiet resolve. "All right," Bannock said, his voice even. "We'll follow Liz's lead." He met Tira's eyes with a faint smile, a silent acknowledgement that this wasn't ideal, but he wanted to avoid making things worse. The group began moving cautiously through the swamp, their steps slow and careful as they avoided puddles and clumps of thick moss. Addie and Mac ventured ahead, occasionally stopping to inspect the ground, and soon Addie called out, waving them over. "Whoa, take a look at these," she said, pointing to a set of strange indentations in the mud. Kelly knelt beside her, examining the prints with a discerning eye. "There, humanoid but smaller," she mused aloud. Devon stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "Swamp goblins," he confirmed, a faint smirk playing at his lips. "Looks like we've got a lead." Max's voice drifted through Tira's mind, laced with a wry humor. "Goblin tracks, how original." She resisted the urge to smile, focusing instead on the footprints. Nearby, Tommy continued fashioning his torch, wrapping the sap-coated club with a bit of fabric he'd found, and securing it with the rope he'd created. "In case we need some light or to defend ourselves," he said, grinning. Mac and Addie gave him encouraging nods as they continued gathering nearby materials. Just then, Tira noticed movement on the far side of the clearing, a figure struggling against the thick mud, his arms raised in a futile attempt to push through it. "Hey," she called to the group, pointing. "There's someone over there." They turned in the direction she indicated, and as they drew closer, they saw a middle-aged man in ragged clothes, his expression contorted with fear and worry. He flailed against the swamp, mud reaching up to his chest, dragging him down. Tira's heart leaped, and she realized with a start that he was drowning. Without hesitation, Liz's voice cut through the group's stunned silence. "Val, help him," she barked, her tone sharp and commanding. Val, almost without a second thought, leaped into the muck and cut through the water toward the man. Her tall, athletic frame moved with a lifeguard's efficiency as she reached him, supporting him with calm strength. She barely noticed the mud soaking her clothes, her focus entirely on getting him to solid ground. The others watched in silent awe as Val's confidence shone through, dispelling their initial assumptions. As the man caught his breath, his gaze moved across them, his eyes wide and wild. "Please," he gasped, his voice rough and pleading. "My daughter, the goblins. They took her." Liz tilted her head, her expression skeptical, treating him as though he were made of cardboard. "A quest, then," she murmured to herself, glancing at Devon, who seemed just as unimpressed. Tira watched as Devon sighed faintly, a flicker of disappointment on his face. Though she wasn't entirely certain, something in his demeanor suggested he might view the man's plight as too convenient, a distraction from the real test. She caught his eye briefly, her gaze questioning, and he offered only a wry, almost bored smirk in return. Meanwhile, Kelly knelt beside the man, gently checking his arms for injuries. "Are you all right, sir?" she asked, her voice soothing. Kenny hovered nearby, his expression tense with concern. "Maybe someone should stay with him, just in case he's too weak to get out of here alone," he muttered. Bannock glanced at Tira, a hint of understanding in his eyes as he noticed her wariness. It seemed he shared her quiet suspicion, the same unease she felt about the man's oddly scripted words and his lack of answers to their questions. The situation felt hollow, rehearsed. She offered Bannock a small nod, and he turned to Kenny and Kelly with a gentle nudge. "Don't worry," Bannock said softly to the twins, steering them back toward the group. "I think he'll be all right, but for now, let's stick together." His calm resolve balanced their worry, allowing them to regroup without further distraction. As they prepared to head toward the thicket, Bannock and Tira exchanged glances, each sensing the group's fragile unity. Tira felt a quiet admiration for Bannock's ability to maintain harmony, even when it meant conceding to Liz's unyielding approach. He stood apart from many others she'd met, different, like the verdant deer she'd heard about, who valued balance and understanding over personal gain. Perhaps, she mused, she would be put in the same house as him. Max's voice whispered through her thoughts, a quiet reassurance that they'd find their path through the chaos. "Good job spotting the drowning man," he said, his words filled with warmth. With a renewed sense of purpose, she moved forward, matching Bannock's steady pace as they ventured deeper into the swamp's shadows. Scene 9. Crossing the divide, the group emerged from a tangled wall of thickets, stepping onto a bank lined with thick, muddy soil. Ahead of them stretched a wide, sluggish river, its dark surface rippling gently under a humid breeze. The air felt heavier here, thick with the scent of moss and decaying leaves, and the buzzing of unseen insects filled the silences between their steps. Tira squinted, her eyes scanning the opposite bank, hoping to catch a glimpse of something useful, a bridge, a dock, a boat, anything to help them cross. "There's nothing here to get across," Bannock muttered, his tone frustrated but calm, scanning the water's edge with a critical eye. Tira watched the line of faint goblin footprints vanish at the river's edge. Maybe the goblins had a boat? Devon dropped to a crouch, his gaze sharp. "Doubtful. Look here." He gestured to the ground, pointing out faint but distinctive webbed indentations within the tracks. "They're amphibious," they swam. Liz glanced at the footprints with a satisfied look, as if solving this clue was another confirmation of her approach. "Which means they're already on the other side and we're stuck over here," she said, her gaze shifting to the others, lingering on Addie with a hint of impatience. Tira caught a flicker of discomfort in Addie's expression as her friend shifted awkwardly, casting an uneasy look at the water. Addie leaned in close and whispered, "Not really my thing, swimming." Bannock's reassuring nod and small understanding smile were quiet gestures of support. "No worries, Addie," he murmured. "We'll figure something out that works for everyone." But Liz was already huddled with Devon and Val, discussing a separate plan, her voice confident and low. "Val, I can grow just enough to carry you and Devon over. We'd cross in minutes without dragging everyone along." Bannock's gaze flicked to Liz, his calm demeanor holding firm. Or we could work together on a plan that gets everyone across. He raised his voice just enough to make sure she heard. Liz rolled her eyes slightly, gesturing that she wasn't the only violator. In fact, everyone was beginning to form clusters, naturally falling into smaller conversations to brainstorm how to make the crossing. Maybe I could cause some plants to grow into a raft, Kelly said to Kenny, who seemed to question the integrity of the vessel. Think you could freeze the whole river? Mac asked Tommy with a grin. Tommy shook his head, wincing slightly as he considered the toll that would take. Freezing all of it would drain my mana. I could only cover parts, maybe just enough for us to step across if we're careful. Devon, overhearing, scoffed, crossing his arms. Then don't bother mentioning it if you can't actually pull it off, he said flatly. Tommy's confidence wavered, but Bannock quickly stepped in with a reassuring hand on his shoulder. It's a solid idea, he said, offering a small, encouraging smile. We might be able to make it work without overdoing it on mana. Tira's mind raced with possibilities, piecing their ideas together. What if Tommy froze certain sections of the river as stepping stones? And we could use the rope to steady ourselves as we cross, she suggested, catching Bannock's eye. Bannock's face lit up at her idea. That's perfect, Tira. He turned to Kelly, who had been quietly working her hands through the vines on the ground, twisting them together. Could you use your plant growth magic to lengthen the vines of Tommy's rope? Maybe turn them into a bridge? Kelly nodded. I think I can make that work, she said. As the group gathered momentum on their plan, Bannock turned to Tira, his eyes warm but curious. What about you, Tira? You've got to have something up your sleeve, any powers you think might help. Tira's breath hitched, her thoughts scrambling as her mind quickly sifted through the implications. The truth of her abilities lingered just below the surface, but her magic, with its taboo nature and dual sensations, felt far removed from their current needs. Necromancy was complex and elusive, a magic that whispered of shadows and the forbidden exchange of life itself. She knew from experience the sharp, confusing sensation it created. Draining life brought a heady rush, while giving life drained her, leaving her feeling fragile and raw. They'd never understand, she thought, an unbidden ache settling in her chest. How could she explain that offering life left her weakened, her own body bearing the wounds she healed in others? Or that the power to take life, while unsettling, gave her a strange, euphoric clarity. It wasn't something she could share without shifting the group's trust. Finally, she offered a small shrug, feigning indifference. Nothing that's really relevant for building a bridge, she said, hoping the casual tone masked the unease beneath her words. I'll stay on standby in case something goes wrong. Bannock held her gaze a moment longer, and she thought she saw the faintest flicker of understanding. But he simply nodded, respecting her choice without pressing further, before turning back to the others. But just as they were finalizing the plan, Liz's voice cut through. I could also grow the vines, you know, she said, an edge to her tone. She held Kelly's gaze, her smirk just visible. Building a bridge is going to take a lot of mana. It sounded like Liz's barbed comment was trying to be helpful. Instead of taking offense, Kelly focused on the vines, reaching out a hand to Liz. I'm fine working with you if you're willing to lend a hand, Kelly said forgivingly. I'll handle the vines weaving if you can help with the growth. Liz's mouth twisted into a slight smirk as she reached out, a faint magical aura flowing from her hand, and without even a single sarcastic remark. Together, their powers stretched the vines into thick, sturdy ropes, weaving them into a path that crossed the murky river. Tommy stepped forward, using small bursts of his mana to freeze patches along the rope bridge. The patches served as sturdy anchors to hold the bridge in place over the water. Not bad, Liz remarked with grudging admiration, though her gaze stayed on the bridge rather than the team. Val went first, her tall frame moving steadily across the makeshift bridge, her steps sure and precise. Tira watched, noting Val's confidence as she navigated the frozen stepping stones, her gaze unwavering as if nothing would shake her. Liz and Devon followed closely behind, their movements swift and practiced, moving together in an easy rhythm. Liz's shoulders were held high, her face unreadable, while Devon wore a steely expression that matched the quiet resolve in his gaze. The rest of the group began to follow in pairs, each of them stepping carefully, finding their footing across the rope bridge. Tira found herself at the back, keeping her eyes on Bannock, who was stationed in the middle, offering quiet words of encouragement to anyone who seemed uncertain just as he did. Their presence together radiated a calm reassurance, and even with the tension hanging in the air, they seemed to ground everyone. Quite the assortment of talents and temperaments, Max's voice drifted through her mind, carrying a note of quiet amusement. I think that teamwork is coming together, Tira replied mentally, her gaze flicking between her group members as they carefully crossed. I think some people are just used to doing things on their own, she observed, her gaze lingering on Liz and Devon. But Bannock's different. I think he's trying to hold everyone together. Good insight, Max replied thoughtfully. But don't ignore your own instincts. You have a way of reading people, Tira, maybe more than you realize. She held his words close, studying the group as they made their way forward. There was an almost fragile balance among them, a mix of cautious steps, hesitant glances, and quiet determination. The weight of what was unspoken lingered in the air, and she found herself wondering if that balance would hold as they ventured further. As she followed the path forward, her mind drifted to Addie, who moved tentatively just ahead, her steps slower, her shoulders tense, her eyes glued to the dark waters below. Bannock's soft encouragement floated back to her as he continued to check on everyone, steady and calm. But halfway across, Addie's foot slipped on a patch of moss. Her arms flailed for balance, and she let out a chirping scream before her body disappeared into the river with a loud splash. Val made a subtle move to help, but Liz held her back with a firm hand. Wait, Liz murmured, her gaze calm but observant, as if watching how Addie would handle the slip. Just behind her, Mac didn't hesitate. He jumped in beside Addie, gripping her around the shoulders to pull her up, but the current surged around them both. It was stronger than he'd expected, and he struggled to keep his footing. Without missing a beat, Kenny leapt down, a shield of protective mana flaring around him. The shield deflected the current's pull just enough for the three of them to regain their footing and clamber back onto the bridge, soaked but safe. As they reached the opposite bank, Addie sat down, wincing as she cradled her leg, clearly in pain. Tira's gaze sharpened with concern as she knelt beside her friend, noticing Liz's critical gaze on Addie. Before Liz could say anything, Tira took a deep breath and reached out, gently taking Addie's injured leg. Allowing her mana to flow, Tira sent a pulse of her own life force into Addie's injury, feeling a warmth in her hand, but a pain that mirrored in her own leg. A dull ache she pushed through as she mended Addie's injury. As Addie's face relaxed, her eyes fluttered open, meeting Tira's with a mix of surprise and gratitude. Tira, thank you, she said softly, her voice touched with awe. Lucky me, getting a healer for a roommate. Tira managed a faint smile, though her own face was tinged with the fatigue she tried to hide. The strain seeped into her bones, heavier than she'd expected. Only Bannock seemed to notice, watching her with a concerned but respectful nod, his gaze warm with silent understanding. The group began to move on, crossing the riverbank's uneven terrain. Bannock lingered a moment, looking back toward Tira, his expression unreadable yet reassuring. You okay? He asked quietly. Go on, she whispered, nodding. I'll be right behind. Bannock hesitated, then gave her one last steady look before following the others, catching up with them as they ventured farther into the swamp. Left alone, Tira let out a soft, pained breath, her leg throbbing. She glanced around, taking in the details of the swamp. A rustle in the underbrush caught her eye, and she turned to see a fat, warty toad. It watched her with wide eyes, frozen in place, vulnerable, as though this was part of the test. The thought lingered a moment longer than it should have. How incredibly vivid it all was, the dampness in the air, the roughness of the plants underfoot. It was easy to forget it was likely a simulation, but the professors had set all this up, knowing her abilities. How much, she wondered, had they planned for her to reveal? When Tira rejoined the group, the limp in her step was gone, her movements smooth once more. She offered Bannock a nod, catching his concerned look, and gave him a small, assuring smile as she fell into pace beside him. Her leg healed. Scene 10, the Goblin Lair. As the group pressed deeper into the swamp, the canopy above grew denser, thick curtains of shadows stretching across the marshy ground. Tira felt a damp chill settle in her bones, her boots soaked and heavy with mud. Their path wound around trees with roots twisting upward like skeletal hands clawing for light, only adding to the quiet tension threading through the group. The low sounds of swamp creatures faded as they continued, replaced by a distant faint glow ahead. Hardly a grand march to glory, huh? Max's voice flickered in her mind, laced with dry humor. Tira's eyes drifted over the figures ahead, and she often found herself focusing on Bannock's steady pace, his calm and unwavering posture. He'd catch her staring and return a smile that felt reassuring, even warm, and Tira couldn't help but wonder if his kindness went beyond their roles as teammates. As they neared a clearing, dim firelight appeared through the thick foliage. They slowed, clustering behind a wall of vines as two goblins came into view, hunched around a smoldering fire pit by the mouth of a cave. The goblins' misshapen forms cast jittery shadows, creating a scene equal parts eerie and ridiculous. The group paused, peering through the leaves to observe. "Shinies! Not enough, not shiny enough," one goblin rasped, his voice thick with excitement. His leathery green face twisted in exaggerated frowns as he pointed at a pitiful collection of stones and tattered socks scattered around his feet. His clothes were an absurd mismatch, bits of algae, muddy rags, and twigs woven into what little hair he had. The fire's faint glow seemed too dignified for the strange creatures, who looked more like children playing dress-up in swamp debris than intimidating guards. "Shinies, yes, but food too," grumbled the other goblin, scratching his elbow with a clawed finger. "No socks for Mudfoot unless shinies come first." The goblins continued their absurd argument, listing their bizarre priorities with glee. Tira caught Bannock's thoughtful gaze as he glanced over the group, his tone low but warm. "All right, thoughts on how to handle this?" Kenny nodded slowly. "Well, they're sentient creatures. Maybe we can talk our way in. We've got numbers after all." Devon scoffed, the smirk audible in his whisper. "I'd say we're giving them too much credit." He tilted his head toward the goblins, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Agreed," Val added, her gaze cold and practical. "It's 10 against 2, she murmured, her brow raised as if the choice were obvious. But then, Tira noticed, Val met Bannock's eyes and relaxed a little, a nod showing she'd defer to his decision. Liz's eyes narrowed slightly as she shifted her gaze from Bannock to the goblins with a dismissive scrutiny. "Force might be the smarter approach," she said, though a glint of something else appeared in her eyes. "But I'll let you call it, Bannock. The crown looks good on you." Her smile was sharp, but Tira sensed a change in her tone, a softening of sorts, allowing Bannock to lead without interference. Bannock met Liz's comment with a calm smile. "Let's not go in swinging just yet. They're just guards. Maybe they'll be more reasonable than they look." Kelly leaned over to Tira and Kenny, her voice thoughtful. "Shinies and socks. Maybe we could just bribe our way in." Bannock raised a brow, nodding slowly as he considered. "How many of us are willing to sacrifice some socks?" Addie made a face but pulled off her muddy socks with a small shrug. "They're wrecked anyway." Val, with a quiet smirk, gestured to a pile of nearby rocks. "I can take care of the shinies." She gathered a few pebbles, passing her hand over them with a soft pulse of mana. The stones shimmered, a dull brown now streaked with silver. She handed them to Bannock. "All yours." "Perfect," he murmured, glancing over the group. "Addie, Mac, you're with me." Addie grinned, tossing her socks to Bannock. "It's an honor, sir," she joked. Mac, with a mischievous grin, smudged mud over Bannock's cheek. "You've got to look the part, dude." Bannock laughed, rubbing more mud over his face as he stepped forward with his diplomats. The rest of the group watched from behind the vines while Devon positioned himself at the edge, poised to act if things went wrong. Tira held her breath, watching Bannock's calm resolve as he approached the goblins, socks and stones in hand. "Greetings, esteemed goblin guards," Bannock began, his voice respectful. "We come bearing gifts in exchange for safe passage." The goblins' heads snapped up, eyes wide as they took in the newcomers and their offerings. The larger goblin, wearing a mossy scarf, squinted at Bannock, licking his lips. "Shiny stones and sakis?" he croaked. reaching out with grubby, clawed hands. Addie held her socks high, grinning. For all your hard work guarding the lair. Finest socks in the swamp. The goblins exchanged giddy glances, nudging each other with wide-eyed excitement. Sockies, yes, yes, the skinny one murmured, reaching for Addie's offering. Then the larger goblin's eyes narrowed, his grin widening in a twisted attempt at a devious smirk. Wait, he leaned toward his companion. I've got an idea, Mudfoot, a brilliant idea. His hideous, gleeful cackle filled the clearing, and Devon's fingers twitched toward his weapon, his muscles taut. Bannock's smile remained patient. All right, let's hear it. The goblin's laughter grew louder, his voice grating. Yes, yes, hand them over, Bannock obliged, passing the items into the goblin's greedy hands. Still laughing, the goblin sneered. Ha! I lied. I was never going to let you enter. But now I have socks and shinies, you stupid human. A tense silence fell over the group. Devon's jaw clenched, and he exchanged a look with Liz, silently asking if he should intervene. Tira's heart lurched as she glanced between Bannock and the goblins, but to her surprise, Liz raised a hand toward Devon, signaling him to stand down. Stepping forward herself, Liz's expression held a new intensity as she approached the goblins, her calm and confident presence a striking contrast to the chaotic scene. Her gaze softened, almost amused, as she locked eyes with the goblins. Hey, boys, she purred, her voice laced with an almost unnatural charm, a spell of allure wrapping around her words. You seem to like shinies and pretty things. The faint shimmer of her voice wove through the air like silk, and Tira couldn't tell it was actual magic or simply Liz's natural magnetism. The goblins froze, their slackened jaws falling open, beady eyes wide with adoration. The larger goblin clutched the socks to his chest, his earlier sneer melting into a look of pure, almost pathetic admiration. Shiny lady, he mumbled, his voice awestruck. Tira felt Max's voice in her mind, tinged with amusement. That one is just full of surprises. Tira's thoughts spun. Liz wasn't just helping them out, this was about control. It was like the same sway she held over Mac and Tommy, now directed toward these goblins. Liz's confidence hadn't waned. If anything, her strength seemed boundless and dangerously captivating. Liz's voice softened, dripping with honey. How about you let my friends through? She gestured to the group, her gaze half-lidded as though the goblins were already forgotten. Anything for shiny lady, the skinny goblin squeaked, practically bouncing with excitement. Goddess of shinies, the larger goblin, previously defiant, nodded fervently, stammering. Yes, yes, anything for shiny lady and her friends. Liz cast a glance over her shoulder, a small smirk tugging at her lips as she caught Bannock's eye. He nodded, gratitude and admiration clear in his gaze. Addie stifled a laugh, nudging Mac as the goblins continued to fawn over Liz, completely under her spell. The tension broke, the group sharing a look of relief and amusement as they stepped forward. Well, you've got yourself a fan club, Bannock teased as he passed Liz, his face blushing like it had back in the auditorium. Tira felt her throat tighten. Liz flashed him a satisfied grin. There's always room for more members. As she led them toward the entrance, the goblins tripped over themselves, bowing and clearing the way. Tommy stepped forward, lighting his makeshift torch. Shadows flickered against the walls, and he held the torch with pride, casting a warm glow that guided them further. Liz turned, catching Tommy's eye. Nice work with the torch, Tommy. Just what we needed. Tommy blinked, a bashful smile spreading across his face. Oh, thanks, Liz. Happy to light the way. His cheeks flushed as he followed her, clearly captivated by her praise. Beside her, Tira felt a pang of uncertainty as she followed. Her gaze drifted to Liz, watching her confidently lead the way. She dismissed Liz as overbearing and power-hungry, but now she wasn't so sure. Liz's charm lingered around her like a magnetic pull, even affecting Bannock. Tira's gaze shifted to Bannock, who walked close to Liz, his smile bright. It's impressive, she told herself, but felt a flicker of suspicion. Is it charm or something deeper? Max's voice floated in her thoughts, calm but sharp. Powerful, yes, but dangerous too, don't you think? She doesn't just want trust, she wants people to follow. Tira's unease grew. Part of her admired Liz, the way she effortlessly held the goblins in sway, but another part sensed something cautionary. Liz was useful, yes, but at what point, she wondered, did useful become dangerous? When Liz moved away from Bannock, Tira approached him, her voice quiet. I didn't think she'd actually step in. Neither did I, he replied, glancing at her with a small smile. But I'm glad she did. The words settled over Tira like a weight. Though she'd only just met Bannock, their shared moments, his gentle encouragement, his steady presence, had felt real. But with a single spell Liz had swept in, drawing Bannock's admiration with a charm so effortless it felt unfair. Is this jealousy? Tira asked herself, glancing away as the group continued. As they stepped into the lair, the darkness closed in, a sense of unity settling over them. But as Tira looked ahead, she felt herself slipping, the dynamic shifting, her place in the group growing uncertain as they moved further into the shadows. Scene 11. The Goblin Village. The damp earth shifted beneath their feet as Tira and the others followed the two goblin guards deeper into the lair. Despite the dim lighting, the path was worn smooth, and faintly luminescent moss bathed the passageways in a soft green glow, lending an odd coziness to the otherwise dank corridors. Tira trailed slightly behind, her spirits low as she noticed Bannock glancing at Liz with a faint, shy smile whenever the goblins fawned over her. Yet the group overall seemed in high spirits, laughing amongst themselves as the goblins continued to treat Liz with an almost comical reverence. The skinny goblin, who had an oversized helmet, kept glancing back to Liz as he chattered. This way, your shiny ladyship. Soon we come to the grand village, and oh, the best socks. Finest in the lands, he puffed up with pride, gesturing animatedly. Every goblin knows shiny lady deserves the best. Liz offered an amused nod, unable to resist the smirk tugging at her lips. Of course, Mr. Mudfoot, lead the way, she said with a regal flourish. The goblin beamed at the sound of his own name coming from her voice, his sharp teeth flashing as he turned back around. Addie snickered. She caught Tira's eye with a grin. Liz, the goblin queen, Addie whispered, leaning close with a mischievous glint in her eyes. I hope we don't have to take them all home with us now. Tira snorted, feeling a little more at ease. Honestly, I'm half expecting her to stay here, she muttered with mock exasperation, still considering that all of this was probably a simulation. Addie rolled her eyes. If she starts handing out rolls and giving pep talks, I'm out, she said, pretending to gag. The whole shiny lady thing's already getting real old. She paused, glancing toward Mac, who was walking a little too closely to Liz, practically hanging on her every word as she humored the goblins. Addie's expression darkened slightly, her voice dropping as she muttered. Tira raised an eyebrow, catching the hint of frustration in Addie's tone. Anything you want to share, you and Mac? She teased gently, nudging her friend. Addie's cheeks tinged pink. No, nothing like that, she said quickly, glancing away, though her voice softened as she added, It's just, he doesn't have to give her all that attention, you know? He's acting like a lost puppy or something. Tira hid her smile, seeing through Addie's denial. Looks like a lot of the boys are distracted by the shiny lady, she said, motioning Addie's gaze over towards Bannock. For a moment she felt lighter, appreciating how a little venting and laughter had lifted her spirits. In her mind, Max's voice chimed in, gentle but firm. Just remember, Liz is still an ally, Tira. There was a faint hint of humor in his tone. A shiny ally. Tira stifled a laugh, and as they walked she felt a growing warmth toward Addie. The cramped tunnel soon opened up into a bustling underground hamlet, dim but lively, filled with goblins of all shapes and sizes going about their day. The hamlet was more bustling village than lair, with stalls and small stands dotting the space, each under a crude banner of tattered cloth. In place of human wares there were odd collections, gleaming stones, mismatched trinkets, and piles of salvaged scraps. One stall held an entire pile of socks in every shape and color, each one dirtier and more worn than the last, proudly displayed as if they were treasures. The larger goblin guard scrambled over to the sock stand, pulling out a frayed pink sock with a large hole in the toe. For the shiny lady, he declared, bowing awkwardly as he presented it to Liz. Liz took the sock with mock reverence and shot a disgusted eye roll at Val. Otherwise, her acting skills were impressive. A royal gift indeed, she said, patting the goblin on his bumpy head. His eyes grew wide with pride, and he scurried off, beaming with joy. Kenny, watching the scene with a hint of wariness, muttered to Kelly, "Don't forget, they're still goblins. We should remain vigilant." Kelly, examining a small goblin bartering over a shiny pebble, shot her brother a disapproving look. "Not every goblin's out to get us, Kenny. They're just different. Not everything is out to get you, you know. Maybe it's a lesson the professors want us to learn?" Kenny sighed, his expression firm. "Being different doesn't mean we shouldn't let our guard down. Goblins are infamously creatures of chaos and trickery." He cast a cautious glance at a group of goblins who were debating intensely over the color of a dirty sock. Kelly shook her head, smiling as one goblin waved a sock triumphantly. "It doesn't hurt to give them the benefit of the doubt sometimes. Maybe you're just being a bit too cautious." Kenny grumbled, crossing his arms. "Maybe you're being too idealistic." Val stepped up beside them, watching the goblins thoughtfully. "Don't worry if they slip up. Dev and I will handle them," she said, her tone neutral but respectful. For the first time since they entered the lair, Bannock wandered a bit closer to Tira, both watching the goblins' antics with fascination. "Who knew goblins would be so obsessed with socks?" he chuckled. Tira laughed, her earlier jealousy all but forgotten. "Honestly, I kind of like them. They're oddly endearing." One goblin child scampered up, a sock on each ear, and squealed in excitement at seeing the shiny lady. Tommy and Mac chuckled at the sight, and even Devin managed a smirk, the child's innocent joy enough to soften his usual stern expression. Tira felt a warmth settle over her, a sense of shared wonder as she watched her friends witness this strange slice of goblin life. As they neared the end of the lair, Tira's thoughts turned back to their mission. Amid the cozy, almost domestic atmosphere, she couldn't ignore the worry gnawing at her. They still needed to rescue the girl, and she couldn't shake the feeling that things might not be as simple as they seemed. She caught Bannock's eye, and he gave her a reassuring nod. "We'll get her back," Bannock said, his voice quiet but steady. "These goblins, so far they're harmless, just as long as we stay on their good side. As long as we have Liz, we should be fine." Tira nodded, appreciating his calm presence, but cringing slightly at the mention of Liz's name coming out of his mouth. Beneath her smile a hint of doubt lingered. The goblins were charming, yes, but the warnings from Kenny weighed on her mind. Their path finally led them to a grander set of doors, grand by goblin standards at least. Heavy and reinforced with mismatched strips of metal, they were covered in scratched etchings that looked like a mix of goblin runes and scribbles. One of the goblin guards knocked twice, puffing up with importance. "Great and mighty Goblin King," he called with dramatic flair. "The shiny lady has arrived." There was a long pause, followed by shuffling sounds from behind the door. The goblin guard turned back to the group, grinning as if he'd accomplished something monumental. But after a moment of awkward silence, he scratched his head, looking sheepish. "Ah, locked," he muttered, blinking in confusion. Liz sighed with exaggerated patience. "Of course it's locked." "Don't you have a key?" The goblin guard shrugged, embarrassed. "Key," as if goblins hadn't heard of such foreign objects. The group exchanged looks, realizing they'd have to figure out a way in on their own. Scene 12. The door. The stone door loomed before the students, marked with faded goblin carvings and scratches that hinted at years of eager, perhaps impatient, hands trying to open it. Devon approached it first, his fingers grazing the carvings, his eyes narrowing as he examined the edges. "There's got to be a lock mechanism somewhere," he muttered, searching. "If I can find it, I should be able to pick it." One of the goblin guards tilted its head in confusion. "What is lock, friend of shiny lady?" he asked, scratching his head as if the concept were foreign. Liz let out an impatient sigh. "Are you telling me we came all this way, and no one knows how to open the door?" She threw her hands up, her voice edged with frustration. "It's your door!" The goblins flinched, bowing low in apology. "We is sorry, shiny lady. If we knew, we'd tell you for sure." The look of genuine distress softened Kelly's expression, and she stepped forward with a warm smile. "It's okay," Kelly said gently, placing a reassuring hand on one goblin's shoulder. "You've done a great job guiding us here. We'll figure the door out. Her calm demeanor seemed to soothe the goblins, who muttered relieved thank yous before backing away. Tommy joined Devon, pulling off his glasses to get a closer look at the door. He traced his fingers along a series of subtle engravings and faint etchings. This door isn't just shut, it's got some kind of weight-based trigger. He pointed to a platform embedded in the floor nearby. If we add enough weight, it might trigger the mechanism. Mac and Val exchanged glances, eyeing a pile of large stones and wooden crates nearby. Let's start loading it up, Val said, rolling up her sleeves and cracking her knuckles. Mac followed suit, and they began piling objects onto the platform. Kenny, observing the process, crossed his arms skeptically and muttered to Bannock, "This seems far too elaborate for goblins. I doubt they'd use anything heavy given their stature." Bannock considered it thoughtfully. "You've got a point, but they've surprised us before." He shrugged with a grin. "Besides, doesn't hurt to try." Kelly overheard her brother, her eyes narrowing in mild irritation. "It's possible for goblins to be strong, you know." Kenny scoffed, crossing his arms tighter. Nearby, Tommy and Devon continued examining the setup. Devon shook his head, a smirk tugging at his lips. "We're overcomplicating this," he muttered. "Goblins aren't exactly masterminds either." Overhearing him, Liz let out an exasperated sigh. "It would be ridiculous that this is what's holding us up," she muttered, glaring at the platform as though her frustration might intimidate it into cooperating. Tira stood back from the group, half listening, as Max's voice resonated in her mind, calm and thoughtful. "Think like a goblin, Tira. Or better yet, think like a professor setting up a test." She felt a faint smile tug at her lips as Max continued. "Lateral thinking, the solution might be so simple that it's hiding in plain sight." Her gaze drifted to the frayed pink sock the goblin had gifted Liz earlier. The goblins had treated it with a reverence that seemed strange, yet fitting in their world. "Hey, Liz," Tira ventured, still processing her own thought. "Can I see that sock the goblins gave you?" Liz looked at her, raising an eyebrow with a mix of irritation and amusement. "The sock, seriously?" She gave Tira a bemused smile before holding it out. "By all means be my guest," she said, rolling her eyes but unable to hide her curiosity. Tira approached the platform, the mismatched pink sock in hand, feeling her friend's doubtful eyes on her. She gently placed the sock in the center of the platform and held her breath. A second passed, then two, and then the door shuddered, groaning as ancient mechanisms stirred to life. Slowly it began to slide open, revealing the room beyond. A moment of stunned silence was followed by laughter and exclamations of surprise. Tommy scratched his head, grinning as he shook his head. "Should have guessed. Of course it was the sock." Tira caught Devon's reluctant nod, a half smile on his face as he looked at her. "Not bad, Tira," he admitted, his tone acknowledging but understated. Even Liz gave her a reluctant nod, crossing her arms but smirking slightly. "Guess that sock wasn't entirely useless after all." "Nice work," she said with a playful eye roll, nudging Tira as she passed. Bannock clapped her on the shoulder with a warm smile. "Brilliant, Tira. That was exactly what we needed." Tira's cheeks warmed, a rush of pride and acceptance lifting her spirits. Addie gave her a cheerful nudge, laughing. "Golden Eagle material, for sure," she teased. In her mind, Max's voice echoed with a light, proud tone. "Well done, Tira. You've unlocked the goblin way of thinking." Tira couldn't help but smile at Max's words, feeling a strange sense of accomplishment from solving the puzzle and being recognized by her friends. The validation felt deeper somehow, a sense of belonging settling within her. Her smile lingered as she followed the group through the doorway, taking a moment to absorb the support she'd felt. It was a sad thought thinking that they'd all be split up into different houses by the end of this. But perhaps part of the reason for the collaboration was to build bridges between the four houses. Beyond the door, a dimly lit room opened up, revealing a throne-like seat at the far end, where a large goblin lounged comfortably. The group froze, exchanging looks of surprise, amusement, and confusion. But what caught everyone's attention was the young girl sitting across from the Goblin King. Scene 13, Goblin Diplomacy. The group stepped into the large, dimly lit chamber. Seated on a makeshift throne of salvaged wood and mismatched pillows, mostly made of socks, was the Goblin King himself, hunched forward, his entire focus on a small wooden board laid between himself and a young girl sitting cross-legged across from him. The scene was far from the fearsome encounter they'd anticipated. "Gah, not my shiny lady," the Goblin King shouted, his frustration evident as he studied the chessboard. "You're too good at this game, Sarah." "Sarah!" Bannock called, stepping forward carefully. The girl glanced up, a gleam of mischief in her deep blue eyes, then returned to her game without acknowledging the newcomers. The Goblin King scratched his chin, his eyes narrowing as he plotted his next move. The two goblin guards who had followed the group in puffed up and announced loudly, "The shiny lady has arrived to see the Mud King." Liz crossed her arms, her expression cool and unimpressed. "All right, let's make this quick. We're here to take her home." The Goblin King, barely lifting his gaze from the game, sighed. "Can't this wait? I'm in the middle of something important here," he muttered, moving a pawn forward with a thud. One of the goblin guards scurried closer, groveling as he insisted, "But Mud King, it's the shiny lady." He seemed convinced this would demand the king's full attention. The king only shrugged, unfazed. "I don't care who she is," he said, watching Sarah make her next move, her face lit with satisfaction. Addie snickered, leaning toward Tira and muttering just loud enough to be heard, "Guess Liz isn't his type, huh?" Liz rolled her eyes, feeling slightly charged by Addie's remark. "Seems his priorities are elsewhere." She shot back before taking a step forward, injecting some authority into her tone. "Look, Your Majesty," she said firmly but politely, "we really need to bring her back to her father. He's worried sick, you see. Perhaps you can continue your game another time?" The Goblin King waved her off, focused on the board. "This game is most important. I'm finally close to winning. Sarah here may be young, but she's clever." He grunted, frowning as she moved her knight to a random position. Devon shook his head, unimpressed, as he watched the game from a distance. "She's making simple mistakes, overextending her position." "Just move your—" The Goblin King shot him a withering look. "No hints, human. I play with honor." His gaze darted back to Sarah. "I am winning this time fair and square," he insisted, trying to convince himself as much as the others. Kenny, frowning, looked over at Kelly. "This feels off. We're just standing here watching a chess game with the Goblin King. Doesn't that seem strange to you?" Kelly crossed her arms, giving him an amused look. "What do you think is going to happen, Kenny?" "Knives flying out of the walls?" Kenny gave a half shrug. "Maybe. It's supposed to be a test. I wouldn't put it past the Academy to throw in a twist." Tommy, fascinated, leaned in to watch, making mental notes of the goblin's approach to the game. "Interesting," he murmured, fascinated as the Goblin King made a game-deciding blunder, moving his knight to a square that effectively trapped his own king. In the next moment Sarah slid her queen into place with a triumphant grin. "Checkmate, Mr. Goblin King." The king's face fell, his shoulders slumping as he scratched his head in disbelief. "Great mucklords, not again." He looked at her with a mixture of frustration and respect. "Fine, fine, humans and their tricky little shinies." Finally, he turned his gaze to the group. "You're here to take her back, are you?" Liz stepped forward, her tone still polite but firm. "Yes, that would be best." The king huffed, waving a dismissive hand. All right, take her. Just don't interrupt my games next time." He gave Sarah a final respectful nod. "Same time tomorrow, Sarah." Sarah beamed as she skipped over to the group. "Sure thing, Mr. King. But I'll still win." As they turned to leave, Bannock gave Tira a small smile, admiration clear in his eyes. "I'm pretty relieved we didn't have to fight any of these guys," he said, with a quiet laugh. "Makes me wonder what the other groups are doing, you know?" Tira chuckled, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction as they started their exit. But then Max's familiar voice floated into her mind, calm and thoughtful. "Hey, Tira, just a thought. Without Liz, it's possible things could have turned ugly here. Maybe a little thank you from you might go further than you think." Tira hesitated, her smile fading as she considered his words. Thank Liz? Her charm could turn people into mindless zombies at times. Still, she had Devon back down, diffusing things with the goblins, and ultimately saved them from a potential massacre. Tira felt the weight of Max's suggestion, and with a steadying breath, she moved toward Liz, who was a few steps ahead, who seemed distraught about something weighing on her mind. "Hey, Liz," Tira called, catching up to her. Liz raised an eyebrow, a flicker of suspicion in her expression. "What do you want?" Her tone was guarded, almost daring Tira to challenge her. Tira swallowed her pride and met Liz's gaze. "You know, the whole shiny lady act really saved some lives back there. The goblins might have put up a fight without you. I think everything turned out really well because of you. So, thanks, you did good." Liz blinked, caught off guard, her lips twitching as if unsure how to respond. After a beat, she replied with a faint smirk. Thanks, I guess?" Her tone was casual, but there was a moment of pause before Liz offered her a small nod of approval, her voice slipping into a rare, almost genuine tone as she muttered, "You, had a lot of MVP moments today." She cleared her throat, glancing away for a beat, then quickly added, "If we got placed in the same house, I wouldn't hate it." Tira didn't miss the slight bounce in her step as she walked away. For a moment Tira blinked, surprised by the uncharacteristic softness in Liz's voice. She could tell that the last compliment had slipped out in a rush, maybe even by accident, and it made the words feel genuine in a way that almost caught her off guard. Tira felt a smile tug at her lips, realizing that perhaps she had earned a kind of respect from her enigmatic teammate. The goblin guards escorted them to the entrance, beaming proudly as they waved the group off. "Anytime, humans, our doors are always open to you. Let's hope we don't have to take you up on that," Mac laughed, waving as they exited. As they journeyed back through the swamp, Sarah walked beside Tommy, Devon, and Val, eagerly recounting her chess victories, as if she'd been on her own grand adventure. Her excitement was contagious, adding a lively undertone to their otherwise cautious retreat through the swamp. Kenny stayed vigilant, taking the lead, his eyes darting to every shadow and suspicious mound of rocks as he lectured over his shoulder. "All right, everyone, stay alert. Look for anything unusual in the terrain. Tripwires, loose stones, even moss can be deceiving." Addie exchanged a mischievous grin with Mac before whispering, "Yes, shiny lady." "Whatever you say, shiny lady," adopting a mock zombie tone and shambling along with exaggerated obedience. Mac, catching on to the act, joined in, also staggering along like a zombie. "Whatever you say, shiny lady. Keep us safe, shiny lady," he echoed, mimicking Kenny's cautionary tone with exaggerated reverence. Kenny whipped around, giving them an exasperated look. "Very funny, guys. I'm serious. There could be real traps out here." Addie couldn't hold back a laugh. We know. Wouldn't want to step on any dangerous moss." She nudged Mac, who chuckled and nodded in exaggerated agreement, still in zombie mode. Kenny, though visibly annoyed, shook his head with a reluctant smile, muttering something about swamp safety as he turned back to his self-imposed duty. As they walked, Liz fell into step beside Tira and Bannock, her usual confidence softened by the comfortable silence that hung between them. For a few moments they moved in sync, their footsteps blending with Sarah's enthusiastic recounting of her victory up ahead. Bannock gave Tira a warm smile. For all our little unexpected detours, things turned out all right. Looks like we worked together pretty well, even with," he paused, casting a playful glance at Liz, "our varied approaches." Liz raised an eyebrow, an amused, slightly flirty smirk playing on her lips as she nudged him. "Is that your way of saying I'm hard to work with?" she teased, letting the words linger just a bit. Bannock chuckled, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Not hard, just creative," he replied, grinning. Liz rolled her eyes, though her smirk softened into a genuine smile. "Well, I guess I can admit it wasn't so bad working with you two either. At least when you behaved." Her voice, usually aloof, held a hint of warmth that felt unguarded. Bannock laughed, slightly blushing, and clearly entertained by her way of giving a compliment. "We'll take what we can get," he replied, his laugh infectious. Tira grinned as she watched them, her initial apprehension toward Liz fading. Liz's interactions with Bannock that had once made her feel uneasy, even threatened, but now, after seeing other sides of Liz, her more genuine moments, Tira felt only a growing camaraderie. Somehow knowing Liz better made her seem less intimidating, and maybe even fun to be around. As they reached the edge of the swamp and returned Sarah safely to her father, Tira felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. Only hours ago, they'd been strangers, jostling for leadership and second-guessing each other's abilities. Now trust was budding, inside jokes were forming, and their shared experience felt like the opening chapter of something more lasting. In her mind, Max's voice echoed, calm and reassuring. Trust the process, embrace the uncertainty. The only thing to fear is fear itself, he reminded her gently. Tira smiled, letting his words settle, and as she looked around at her new friends, she felt ready to learn what house she'd soon become a new member of. Scene 14, the sorting ceremony. The auditorium buzzed with an almost electric anticipation. Students filled every seat, eyes trained on the stage as they waited, each cloaked in an air of expectancy. To Tira, the atmosphere felt like a graduation, but with a fresh undercurrent of excitement. This ceremony marked the official welcoming into Manaheim Academy, where they'd each receive a house mantle, a cloak symbolizing their place within the school. As the lights dimmed, Professor Aubergine stepped forward, his robes flowing with a bright scholarly elegance that matched his lively energy. His gaze swept the room, eyes warm but keen. "Welcome back, students," he began, his voice both inviting and authoritative. "By now, you've each completed your first trial of many, a journey into the unknown that was both real and not." He paused to let the words sink in. Yes, the quest was a simulation. But in those moments you acted on instinct, learning from every step you took, every choice you made. And yes, he chuckled, for those who may have had a bit of trouble staying on their feet, remember that this is the place for mistakes. Manaheim is where we fail faster in order to learn sooner, to sharpen ourselves for life's trials beyond our halls. Around her, Tira caught glimpses of relief or disappointment on a few faces. She glanced at her group, feeling an inner calm in their presence. She realized that rather than drained, she felt refreshed. Perhaps, she thought, stepping back into reality had been designed to grant them rejuvenation. Professor Aubergine continued with a twinkle in his eye. "Now you've each shown promise. You've tested yourselves, and today you're ready to stand in the place that best nurtures you." He extended a hand toward the woman in the squash and zucchini robes, the bespectacled Madame Courgette, who stood beside him with a gleeful smile. "When your name is called," Madame Courgette's voice rang out, squeaky yet clear. "Please come up to receive your house mantle." The ceremony began with a soft murmur of applause as each student approached the stage and received their cloak from their house professor. Chris Aaron, a boy with dark eyes and a tall, serious frame, stood and walked to the stage, receiving his blue mantle for the Azure Bears. A murmur of applause rippled through the room as he returned to his seat. One by one, each student approached the stage where they received their cloak from their house professor. The ceremony continued. Tira watched with bated breath as students from various groups were sorted, the atmosphere brimming with anticipation. Then the first name of Tira's group was announced. Mac Blackwood. Mac strode confidently to the stage, a mix of pride and casual certainty on his face. Already wearing his yellow golden eagle jacket, he looked as if he'd known all along. A few chuckles rippled through the crowd, and Tira found herself smiling. Mac in his element seemed born for the Golden Eagles. As he shook the hand of his house professor, he caught Tira's eye and tied his thumbs to create wings out of his hands, inspiring cheers from other Golden Eagles in the crowd. With a grin, Mac returned to his seat, the yellow mantle draped over his shoulders like a statement. Tira watched closely as the Broadnoxie twins, Kelly Broadnoxie and Kenny Broadnoxie, were called. They both rose, ascending the stage one after the other. Kenny's serious focus contrasted with Kelly's warm, enthusiastic energy, yet both were sorted into the Azure Bears. Tira marveled at their differences and similarities, Kenny's cautious pragmatism and Kelly's open conscientiousness. They embodied two different sides of the same coin, and Tira couldn't help but think how well their Azure Bear mantles suited them, grounding them in a sense of stability. "Thomas Elfkyle." Tommy walked to the stage with a quiet resolve that struck Tira. She remembered how he'd shared his desire to break out from his family's legacy. When he donned the Golden Eagle's yellow mantle, he wore it as if it were the first page in his own story. His gaze found hers. He fixed his glasses and gave her a small, determined smile, a look that said he was finally ready to make his own mark on the world. Devon Grazzo. Devon's name reverberated through the hall, drawing a hush over their group as he took the stage with disciplined poise. His crimson tiger's mantle seemed to amplify his fierce resolve, perfectly matching his natural intensity. As he returned to his seat, his expression was unreadable, yet Tira sensed a quiet contentment. Devon was where he belonged. Elizabeth Hadbucks. Liz ascended the stage with her signature, confident stride, accepting her crimson tiger's mantle with an almost theatrical elegance, shaking hands with her house professor as if she were royalty. As she turned, her eyes caught Tira's, and Liz gave her a playful wink, a glint of pride in her gaze. Tira couldn't help but think how right it felt to see Liz and Devon in the Crimson Tigers, two intense forces bound by the same fierce energy. Glancing around, Tira noted how few Crimson Tigers were being called. Having two in their group felt rare, as if it added an extra layer of strength to their team. As Tira watched the sorting unfold, she noticed Max's voice offering quiet commentary in her mind. Addie Lum. Addie shot Tira a beaming smile before practically bouncing down the steps to receive her Golden Eagle cloak. She accepted her mantle with a bright energy, waving back at the group. She looked radiant in the yellow, her joy grounding Tira with a sense of ease. Bannock McBain. Bannock's name brought a flutter of surprise to Tira, and she watched him with renewed interest. He ascended with quiet assurance, and when the verdant deer green mantle settled over his shoulders, she felt a surge of recognition. Verdant deer's compassion and wisdom fit him perfectly. His grounding presence in the swamp had been just the first glimpse of that depth. As he returned to his seat, he caught her eye, giving a nod that sent a warmth through her. Valerie Magnoti. Val walked confidently, her calm expression unwavering. When she too received the verdant deer mantle, Tira felt her assumptions shift. She'd expected Val in the Crimson Tigers, but seeing her in verdant deer brought a hidden warmth to light, a quiet complexity Tira had sensed but hadn't fully understood. Val's knowing glance toward Bannock deepened Tira's growing connection to her friends and their new house. Perhaps there's more to Val, still awaiting discovery. Max's voice murmured. Then came the long stretch between Magnoti and Walder, giving Tira time to mull over her place among the houses. Azure bears, she thought, picturing herself in the blue mantle alongside Kelly and Kenny. The stability appealed to her, but it also felt potentially suffocating. Her thoughts drifted to the Golden Eagles. With Addie, Mac, and Tommy, the Golden Cloak felt bold and adventurous, a space to explore. But perhaps it was too loud for her. The Crimson Tigers intrigued her too. Strength, tenacity, qualities she aspired, but didn't quite feel. The fiery energy seemed overwhelming. She wasn't sure she'd thrive in such an intense environment. And then verdant deer, with Bannock and Val. The green mantle's quiet wisdom, harmony, and empathy held a peacefulness she found deeply comforting. It felt like home. Teresa Walder. The sound of her true name broke through her thoughts. She rose, each step amplifying the low thrum of nerves in her chest. The auditorium seemed vast, the lights almost blinding, until a familiar voice rang out. Go, Tira. Addie's cheer was clear and bright, bolstered by claps from her friends. Bolstered, she continued up to the stage, meeting Professor Aubergine's kind eyes as he extended his hand. She shook it, feeling warmth seep through her as he held her gaze. Then she turned to face Professor Mridle, her expression calm and serene. With her unique orange eyes, so much like her own late mother's, Professor Mridle looked at her with a warmth that felt familiar. Welcome home, Tira, she whispered, draping the verdant deer mantle around her shoulders. The words struck a deep chord within her, the cloak settling over her as if sealing a promise. The weight of the green mantle felt like an embrace, not of being a misfit, like what many might say about the deer, but of belonging. She returned to her seat, her head held high, feeling as though she'd embraced something she'd thought previously unattainable. As she sat, she took in the sight of her friends, each now adorned in their new colors. Addie, Mac, and Tommy in bright yellow, Kelly and Kenny in the grounding blue, Liz and Devon in fierce crimson, and Bannock, Val, and herself in calm, wise green. A quiet joy blossomed within her, a victory not of strength, but of connection. Surrounded by friends in every color, she felt the bonds forming between them. In her mind, Max's voice echoed, gentle and pleased. See, Tira, it never mattered where you ended up, you've already found your place. She smiled, feeling it bloom in her heart as she looked out across the room, anticipation for what lay ahead. This was only the beginning, and with her friends by her side, she felt ready for anything. Scene 15, camping on the quad. The late afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the Manaheim Academy quad, its light dancing across the cobblestone paths and leafy trees. Generations of students had gathered here over centuries, and now it was their turn. The 10 friends sat in a loose circle on the green lawn, absorbing the grandeur of the ancient buildings surrounding them, each wearing their house cloaks as a group for the first time. It felt both inspiring and surreal. Addie, her fingers crackling with energy, grinned mischievously as she cupped her hands together, conjuring a tiny flame that flickered into a campfire-sized glow. She set it carefully in the center of the group, her eyes dancing with excitement. What's an outdoor hangout without a little campfire, right? She gave Tira a wink. Kelly beamed, setting out sandwiches wrapped in simple cloth, a colorful spread of bright greens and fresh veggies. I made lunch, she announced proudly. She held one out to Devon, who took it but arched an eyebrow. What are you, allergic to protein? Devon observed, inspecting the sandwich. Kelly smirked, unfazed. Well, I'm a vegetarian, she said simply. Besides, some of us are trying to keep our bodies as healthy temples. Kenny, who had taken his own sandwich with a tentative bite, shrugged. Welcome to my life, Dev, he mused. Then he added, glancing at Devon with curiosity. Did you think the simulation could have used something a bit more? I don't know, combative? I felt like there was too much focus on diplomacy. Devon's eyes lit up, nodding in agreement. Right? I can't believe some of those groups didn't even rescue the girl. Did they seriously get downed by those little runts? As Kenny and Devon settled into their discussion on the simulation's mechanics, Max seized the moment to entertain the group with a more light-hearted reflection. Standing up dramatically, he cleared his throat and folded his hands in a poor imitation of a goblin. Oh, shiny lady, forgive me, my life is but a speck compared to yours, he cried, dropping to his knees before Liz in an exaggerated bow. Tommy joined in, fumbling with a pretend invisible crown. Only a true goblin queen could lead us to the finest socks and shiniest of stones. Your most royal shiny lady, he croaked, staggering around as if he were under a spell. Liz laughed, tossing her hair as if she were basking in royal attention, then looked over at Devon, grinning. Come on, Dev, join in. Every queen needs her goblin king, don't you think? Devon groaned, giving her an eye roll, but finally relenting, joining Mac and Tommy with a low, dramatic bow. You guys are acting like a bunch of idiots, he said, his deadpan delivery adding to the laughter that erupted around them. Across from them, in the warm glow of the campfire, Bannock glanced over at Tira, a soft smile lighting up his face. You know, I had a feeling you'd be in verdant deer with me, he said, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Really glad we'll get to explore it together. Tira felt a warmth bloom in her chest, his words filling her with a quiet joy. She returned his smile, though her gaze shifted to the side, the closeness stirring a slight hesitation. She wasn't sure yet if she was ready for this new tether, and her heart fluttered in a way that felt both familiar and unknown. Keeping her voice light, she replied, Yeah, it does feel right, almost like coming home. Glancing over at Val, who sat beside them, she added with a small laugh, And with Val around, I think we're in for some interesting times. Val, catching their exchange with a mouthful of food, gave Tira an approving nod and a rare smile as she reached for another sandwich. Kelly, mind sharing the recipe for these? Val asked, her voice warm. They're amazing. I'd love to give them a try. Absolutely, Kelly replied, her face lighting up. Anything for a fellow chef. As the golden light of early evening bathed them, the group fell into a comfortable silence, each lost in their own reflections. Tira let herself take in the warmth of their presence, the laughter and shared smiles, the easy sense of belonging. The academy felt vast and daunting, but right now everything felt exactly as it should be. In her mind, Max's voice stirred, calm and steady. There was a deeper, almost nonverbal tone in his presence, as if hinting at the layers of mystery within Manaheim, yet to be discovered, that were raw and emotional beyond proper articulation. An image of Professor Myrtle's orange eyes flickered in her mind, the familiarity striking, as if it held an answer she hadn't thought to ask. There was an entire world of secrets woven into Manaheim's ancient halls, and Max's presence in her mind whispered of something more. She'd just begun to uncover what the academy held, and it felt thrilling to think of all the unanswered questions waiting for her. "Trust the journey," she murmured softly, her eyes bright with the thrill of the unknown. A smile crept over Tira's face, her heart swelling as she looked around the circle, absorbing the harmony in their laughter, their teasing, their stories. She hadn't found her place through force or dominance, but through connection, acceptance, and trust. This was her new beginning, and for the first time she was ready to embrace every uncertain step.